My ex-husband left me with a newborn and never paid child support. But when 10 years later he found out that I own the company where he works, he came to my office and said, "Forgive me." I answered with 2 words. Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that hindsight is 20/20. Looking back now, I can see every single red flag I chose to ignore. Every warning that passed me by like smoke through an open window. But back then, back when I was 26 years old and newly married to Daniel Carter, I believed in things like love and second chances and the fundamental decency of people. I believed in him. We met in Portland, Oregon at a friend's birthday party. He was charming in that effortless way that some men are. Broad-shouldered, quick with a joke, the kind of man who made a room feel smaller just by walking into it. We dated for 8 months. We married in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside the city. My mother wore yellow. My best friend Lisa cried during the vows. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. The first year of our marriage was ordinary in all the ways that ordinary can still be beautiful. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District. Daniel worked as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a regional freight company called Vantage Supply Company. I worked as an operations analyst at a mid-size consulting firm, a job I was good at and quietly loved. We cooked dinner together on Sundays. We argued about small things, whose turn it was to call the plumber, whether to spend Thanksgiving with his family or mine. Nothing serious, nothing that felt like a warning. Then I got pregnant, and something shifted in him, not dramatically, not all at once. It was subtle enough that I kept convincing myself I was imagining it. He started coming home later. He took more weekend calls. When I brought up the nursery, he changed the subject. When I asked him if he was excited, he said, "Of course," in a tone that meant nothing at all. The warmth that had drawn me to him seemed to be draining away slowly, the way color fades from a photograph left too long in the sun. I told myself it was stress. I told myself he was adjusting. New fathers got scared. I had read that somewhere. It was normal. What was not normal was what happened 6 weeks after our daughter Emma was born. I had been awake for 33 hours. Emma had colic and screamed through the night in a way that split the air and made thinking impossible. I had just finally gotten her to sleep in her crib and walked to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea when I noticed that Daniel's side of the closet was empty. Not partially empty, completely empty. His suits were gone. His shoes, the leather bag he traveled with, his electric razor from the bathroom counter. There was no note. He did not answer his phone that day or the next. His mother, when I finally called her in desperation, told me that Daniel was going through something and that I should give him space. I was holding a 6-week-old infant. I was hemorrhaging emotionally and physically recovering from a difficult delivery, and I was being told to give him space. He sent a text message 4 days later. It said, "I'm not ready for this life. I'm sorry." That was it. No address, no explanation, no offer to help with Emma, with rent, with anything. He simply disappeared the way some men do, quietly, completely, without looking back. I filed for divorce. I hired a lawyer with money I borrowed from my mother. Daniel didn't contest it. He didn't show up. He didn't call. He never paid a single dollar of child support, not because the court didn't order it, but because he moved around enough and worked in ways that made enforcement slow and painful. The checks that did come were sporadic, always late, always short. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I raised Emma alone. I worked full-time. I put her in daycare. I took her to pediatrician appointments and school plays and swim lessons. I was her mother and her father and every other thing she needed. And somewhere in the exhaustion and the grief and the quiet rage that I learned to carry the way you carry a stone in your chest, somewhere in all of that, I built something. 10 years later, I was sitting at the head of a mahogany conference table on the 14th floor of a building I owned, reviewing quarterly reports for a company I had built from nothing. And my assistant knocked on the glass door of my office and said there was a man named Daniel Carter asking to see me. I set down my pen very carefully. I straightened the papers in front of me, and I said, "Send him in." He walked through the door looking older, smaller somehow, the easy confidence of his youth worn thin. He stood across from me and said the word I had waited 10 years to hear, or thought I had waited for. He said, "Forgive me." And I answered him with 2 words. But to understand what those 2 words were and why they carried the weight they did, you need to understand everything that happened in between. The night Daniel walked out, I didn't cry. I think I was too shocked to cry. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I never drank and stared at the wall while Emma slept in her crib down the hall, making those small, soft sounds that newborns make, completely unaware that her life had already been broken before it had properly begun. The crying came later. It came in the car, mostly, during the 15-minute drive to the daycare, when I was alone and the radio was off and there was nothing to perform for. I cried so often during those drives that Emma once asked me, when she was about 4, why my eyes were always red when I picked her up. I told her I had allergies. Let me tell you what Daniel left me with. He left me with a $2,100 a month rent I could not afford alone. He left me with $14,000 in shared credit card debt that the court ultimately split between us, but which I had to carry while he vanished. He left me with a child who would wake up at 2 a.m., reaching for a father who was not there and would not be there, and for whom I had no explanation that didn't break my own heart to say. He left me with a court order for $800 a month in child support that was worth less than the paper it was printed on, because Daniel moved between jobs and states with the ease of a man who understood exactly how to stay just out of reach of the system designed to hold him accountable. The first year was the hardest. I moved out of the Pearl District apartment and into a smaller place in a less expensive part of the city. My mother helped me with Emma twice a week so I could work late. My friend Lisa brought me food sometimes without making a production of it. She would just text me, "I'm outside," and there would be a bag from the Thai place I liked hanging from the door handle. I don't know if she understood how much that mattered. I never found the right way to tell her. At work, I kept my head down and delivered results because I could not afford to be anything other than excellent. My manager at the consulting firm, a woman named Margaret Holloway, noticed. She gave me more responsibility. I took it. I took everything that was offered to me because every raise, every promotion, every small advancement was a brick I was laying in some structure I couldn't fully see yet but knew I was building. But the fear never left. It lived in the practical details of my life the way a draft lives in a room. You stop noticing it consciously, but it never stops touching you. What if Emma got sick and I couldn't cover the medical bills? What if I lost my job? What if the car broke down? What if? I made lists. I made budgets. I cut everything that wasn't essential, and I saved with a discipline that was less a virtue than a survival mechanism. And somewhere around Emma's 3rd birthday, the fear began to change shape. It was a Tuesday evening. Emma was asleep. I was sitting on the floor of my small living room with my laptop and a glass of wine I'd been nursing for 2 hours, going through my accounts the way I always did at the end of the month. And I looked at the numbers, at what I made, at what I spent, at what I had managed to save. And I thought, this isn't enough. This will never be enough. Not for Emma. Not for the life I want to give her. And then, for the first time, I thought something different. Something that wasn't fear and wasn't grief and wasn't the low hum of surviving. I thought, what if I built something of my own? I had been working in operations and consulting for 6 years by then. I understood how companies ran, how they sourced, contracted, managed supply chains, controlled costs. I had watched senior partners and executives make decisions I knew were wrong and deliver results I knew I could exceed. The knowledge was in me. I had simply never considered that I was allowed to use it for myself. I started slowly. I took 2 online business courses at night after Emma was in bed. I read obsessively: logistics, entrepreneurship, operations management, corporate law. I began drafting a business plan the way I drafted reports at work, systematically, with data, without sentiment. It took me 4 months to produce something I felt I could show another person. I showed it to Margaret Holloway over coffee on a Saturday morning. She read it in silence for 22 minutes. Then she looked up at me over her reading glasses and said, "Rachel, this is good. This is genuinely good." She became my first mentor and eventually my first investor. The plan was simple in structure: a mid-sized operations consulting and supply chain management firm targeting regional freight and logistics companies, exactly the sector I understood best, exactly the world Daniel had worked in before he walked away. The irony of that was not lost on me. It would not be lost on me later either. I did not think about Daniel when I built the plan. I didn't build it for revenge or for satisfaction or for any reason that had anything to do with him. I built it for Emma. I built it for myself. I built it because the woman sitting on that floor had decided she was done being afraid. That decision, quiet and private and made in a living room at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, was the moment everything changed. I registered the company in the state of Oregon on a Thursday in March, 7 months after I sat on that floor with my laptop and made my decision. I named it ClearPath Operations LLC. It was a name that meant something to me. Clear path forward, no looking back, no obstacle permanent enough to stop you if you kept moving. The attorney who handled the filing was a soft-spoken woman named Carol Dean, who had been recommended to me by Margaret. She reviewed my paperwork, filed my articles of incorporation, and shook my hand across her desk when it was done. "Congratulations," she said. "You're officially in business." I drove home and cried in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I collected myself. Then I picked Emma up from school and took her to get ice cream and told her that something good had happened today, though I didn't tell her what. The early months of ClearPath were exactly as difficult as I had expected, and in several ways, I had not. Building a client base from scratch while working part-time hours around Emma's schedule required a level of focus that I had to consciously protect. I woke up at 5 in the morning. I worked in the evenings after she went to bed. On weekends, I brought her to Margaret's house sometimes, where she played in the yard while Margaret and I talked through contracts and client strategy at the kitchen table. It was unglamorous. It was grinding. And it was mine. Within 18 months, I had 3 paying clients. Within 3 years, I had 14. Margaret had referred me to 2 of them. The rest came through my own network, people I had worked with at the consulting firm, former colleagues, managers who had watched me work and knew what I could deliver. I built a small team, 2 full-time analysts, a part-time accountant, and an office manager named Priya, who was so organized she made me feel slightly chaotic in comparison. By the time Emma was starting 4th grade, ClearPath Operations was generating just over $3 million in annual revenue. And I had never once told Daniel Carter any of this. He had drifted back in and out of Emma's life in the way that made everything worse. Not absent enough to be cleanly absent, not present enough to be any real comfort to her. He had remarried. A woman named Stacy, who I knew of through public social media and through the occasional mentions Emma made when she came back from one of her rare visits. Stacy had 2 children from a previous relationship. She and Daniel lived in a suburb south of Portland. He was working, as of Emma's last visit, at a logistics company, a regional freight firm. I didn't think much of this detail at the time. It was Carol Dean who flagged it for me. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon about 3.5 years into ClearPath's operation, when I was in the middle of reviewing a vendor contract. "Rachel," she said without any preamble, "I need you to look at something. Can you come in?" I went in the following morning. She laid 3 documents on the desk between us. The first was a printout of the corporate registration for a small logistics consulting firm called Apex Route Solutions, registered 18 months prior. The second was the registration for a related LLC, an entity called DRC Holdings. The third was a document that made my hands go still on the desk. DRC Holdings had filed a complaint with the Oregon Business Registry alleging that ClearPath Operations had engaged in predatory client solicitation, targeting Apex Route's existing client base. The complaint was thin. It had no real legal teeth, Carol explained, but it was clearly intended to harass, to slow me down, to create noise. The filing date was 3 weeks ago. "Who is DRC Holdings?" I asked. Carol turned the page. The registered agent of DRC Holdings was listed as Daniel R. Carter. I sat very still for a moment. "He works at one of the firms in your competitive space," Carol said quietly. "My best read is that someone connected to Apex Route found out about ClearPath, realized you were pulling clients from their pipeline, and ran your name. When they ran your name, they found Daniel. And Daniel—" She paused. Daniel decided this was an opportunity. So, he had rebuilt himself. He had a new family, a new job, a position in an industry I had built expertise in. And when he discovered that his ex-wife, the woman he had abandoned with a 6-week-old baby, had built a company that was competing in his space, his first instinct was not to feel ashamed. His first instinct was to attack. I looked at the filing. I read his name on the document. Daniel R. Carter, registered agent, DRC Holdings. And something locked into place inside me. Not rage, not even hurt. Something colder and more useful than either. This was the moment I understood that an apology would never be enough, and that the time for being cautious and quiet and patient was over. I looked at Carol across the desk. "What can we do?" I asked. She smiled for the first time since I'd sat down. "Quite a lot," she said. Carol and I spent the next 3 weeks preparing a counter-response to the harassment complaint that was, in her words, surgically precise. We documented every client relationship ClearPath had built, email histories, signed contracts, introductory correspondence, proving definitively that not a single one of our clients had been poached from Apex Route Solutions. We further identified that Apex Route itself was a relatively new entrant to the market, founded after ClearPath, and that several of the clients they were now claiming as theirs had approached ClearPath first and been turned away because we weren't the right fit for them at the time. In other words, Their complaint was not only unfounded, it was factually inverted. We filed our response with the Oregon Business Registry. Carol also drafted a formal letter to DRC Holdings, noting that the filing appeared to constitute tortious interference and that if the harassment continued, we would pursue civil litigation. She sent it certified mail. Simultaneously, I did something else, something I had been quietly preparing for 6 months. I acquired Apex Root Solutions, not directly, not obviously. I had been working with a business broker named Tom Ferretti, who had identified that Apex Root's primary investor, a man named Glenn Marsh, was looking to exit. The company had grown too slowly, burned through its early capital, and Marsh was tired of waiting for returns. I had made a quiet offer through an intermediary entity at a price Marsh found attractive. The acquisition was completed before Daniel or anyone at Apex Root understood what was happening. The moment the transfer of ownership was finalized, I became Daniel Carter's employer. He found out on a Friday afternoon. I know this because he called me for the first time in years, not through lawyers or through texts about Emma's schedule, but directly on my cell phone. I was in my car in the ClearPath parking lot, about to drive to pick Emma up from school. I answered, "Rachel." His voice was strange, tight, something between anger and something I couldn't name. "What did you do?" "I'm not sure what you mean, Daniel," I said. "You bought Apex." He said it like an accusation. "ClearPath Operations completed an acquisition this week. Yes," I said. "Is there something I can help you with?" There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to check that the call hadn't dropped. "You can't do this," he said finally. "I believe I just did," I said. "Have a good evening, Daniel." I hung up. The pressure came fast after that. 3 days later, a man I had never met, a lawyer representing Glenn Marsh, who apparently felt he had been deceived about the identity of the buyer, sent a demand letter claiming the acquisition had been made in bad faith. Carol reviewed it and told me it had no legal merit but would need a formal response. 2 days after that, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, a man who identified himself only as a friend of the Carter family, who suggested, in language that was carefully indirect, that it would be in my best interest to sell Apex Route back to its management team at a reduced price. I recorded the call. I sent the recording to Carol and to a contact I had at the Oregon Attorney General's office. Then Daniel himself came to my office. He walked in on a Tuesday morning with a man I recognized as his current supervisor at Apex Root TU, a thick-set man named Gary Holt, who had the look of someone who believed that volume was the same thing as authority. They had not made an appointment. My assistant, Priya, came to find me with an expression that told me everything I needed to know before she said a word. I told her to let them in. They sat across from me in my conference room, the same conference room where, years later, the scene you already know would take place. And Gary Holt told me, in a voice pitched just slightly too loud, that I had made an enemy I didn't want, and that the people behind Apex Route's original investor group had resources I was not aware of. He did not specify what those resources were. He didn't have to. The implication was clear. I let him finish. Then I slid a folder across the table. Inside was the recording of the phone call, a copy of the certified demand letter we had received, documentation of the harassment filing, and a brief memo from Carol outlining the specific statutes under Oregon law that each of these actions potentially violated. "I suggest you consult your own legal counsel," I said, "before any of you take another step." Gary Holt's face went the color of old brick. Daniel said nothing. He stared at the folder, and he said nothing at all. They left. That evening, I drove to the Oregon coast. I checked into a small inn in Cannon Beach that Emma and I had visited once, years earlier, when she was 7 and had wanted to see the ocean. I took a long walk on the beach in the November cold. I ate dinner alone at a small restaurant and ordered the salmon and a glass of white wine and watched the water. I needed 2 days. 2 days to breathe and to remember why I had built everything I had built and for whom. On the 3rd morning, I drove home. I was ready. The offer arrived in my email inbox on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Gary Holt and Daniel had walked out of my conference room. It came through a business broker I didn't know, a Portland firm called Meridian Advisory Group, and it was framed with great professional smoothness as an unsolicited expression of interest in acquiring ClearPath operations. The number they offered was real. It was not insulting. It was, in fact, slightly above what ClearPath would have been worth to an outside buyer 2 years prior. Whoever had assembled it had done their research, and they wanted me to know it. I sat with the email for exactly as long as it took me to read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Carol with a single line. Thoughts? Her response came back within the hour. This is Daniel's people trying to buy you out before you become a bigger problem. Your call, but my advice is silence. I did not respond to Meridian Advisory Group. I did not reject the offer formally. I simply did not respond, which is its own kind of answer. 3 days later, I received a handwritten note. It came in a cream envelope with no return address, slipped under the door of my office suite on a morning when Priya was running late. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had thought hard about every word. The note was from Stacy Carter, Daniel's wife. She wrote that she understood there was a difficult history between Daniel and me. She wrote that she hoped, for Emma's sake, that we could find a way to move past old grievances. She wrote that she was sure I was a remarkable woman and that she had always admired strong mothers. The flattery was so thorough and so layered that reading it felt like being wrapped in something slightly suffocating. The last paragraph asked me to consider a meeting, just the 2 of them and me, nothing formal, to clear the air. I put the note in a file folder and labeled it with the date. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. What I felt in that period, what I cultivated deliberately because I had learned by then that emotion is a resource and must be managed like any other, was a form of cold, steady clarity. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me rattled. They wanted me to feel the pressure of their attention and respond from a place of emotion rather than strategy. They had misunderstood me completely. They had confused my patience for weakness for years. That mistake was their problem, not mine. I called Lisa that week. Lisa Park had been my best friend since our sophomore year at the University of Oregon, where we had been assigned to the same dormitory floor and had bonded over a shared hatred of the dining hall's attempt at pasta. She'd been at my wedding. She had cried when I called her the day Daniel left. She had driven to my apartment with Emma's favorite stuffed animal when Emma had her first ear infection and I was running a fever simultaneously and had no idea how to manage both. We met at a coffee shop in the Northwest District, the same one we had been going to since our 20s, where the owner still remembered our orders. She listened to everything. The acquisition, the harassment filing, the buyout offer, Stacy's note. She didn't interrupt. She didn't perform outrage, which was one of the things I valued most about her. She let me finish. Then she said, "What do you need?" I thought about it. "I need someone to tell me I'm not crazy," I said. "You're not crazy," she said immediately. "You're the most methodical person I have ever watched be slowly pushed toward the edge of something, and the fact that you're still this composed makes me slightly afraid of you in the best possible way." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I had produced in about 3 weeks, and the physical sensation of it surprised me. Lisa also said something else that mattered. She said, "Emma is going to know, someday, exactly what you did. Not just the company, all of it. The fact that you kept going. The fact that you kept being her mother and building something at the same time. She is going to know." I drove home that evening with the windows down, even though it was cold. I thought about Emma, who was 13 now and growing in every direction at once. Smart, funny, occasionally impossible, and increasingly aware that the shape of her childhood had been formed by her mother's determination and her father's absence. I thought about what Lisa had said, and then I went home and I got back to work. The antagonists were watching. I could feel it. The quiet of the period after their overtures had gone unanswered, the way you feel someone studying you from across a room. They were regrouping. They were deciding what to do next. I was not afraid. Or rather, I was afraid the way a surgeon is afraid before a difficult operation, aware of the stakes, aware of the margin for error, but trained past the point where fear controls the hand. I kept my head down. I kept building. They came to my office on a Tuesday morning in February, 2 months after the buyout offer had been ignored and Stacy's handwritten note had gone unanswered. Priya called me from reception in the tone she used when something required my immediate attention. "Mr. Carter and his wife are here," she said. "They say they'd like 5 minutes." I was in the middle of a vendor call. I asked the vendor if I could put them on a brief hold, and I stood at my window for a moment looking out at the city. 5 minutes, I thought. Fine. Let them have 5 minutes. I had them brought to the small conference room, not my main office, not the mahogany table, but the smaller room adjacent to reception, with the standard issue chairs and the frosted glass that made everything slightly gray. A deliberate choice. I did not offer them coffee. Stacy Carter was exactly what I had expected from the handwritten note, carefully put together, warm in a way that felt like a performance, with the particular kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes. She wore a camel-colored coat and a scarf in muted tones. She looked at me with an expression of deep, practiced empathy. Daniel sat slightly behind her, which told me something immediately. This had been her idea. "Rachel," Stacy began, "we really appreciate you seeing us. We know you're busy." "I am," I said. I did not sit. I stood at the end of the table with my arms at my sides. "What can I do for you?" She began with the personal. It was skillfully done. She talked about Emma, about how she loved Emma, about how much Daniel wished things had been different, about the ways that anger between parents damaged children. She was not wrong about any of it in the abstract, but she was using it the way you use a lever, to move something, not because you care about the weight. "We came here because we think you're holding on to something," Stacy said, and her voice had shifted slightly. Softer, more intimate, as if we were close friends having a difficult conversation rather than two strangers in a room where I controlled the chairs. The past. What Daniel did. It hurt you. Of course it did. But what you're doing now, taking over the company, restructuring things the way you have, it feels like it's more about punishing him than about any of us moving forward. She let that sit. "I understand why you'd see it that way," I said. "Don't you think Emma deserves parents who aren't at war?" Daniel said. It was the first thing he had said since sitting down. His voice had the careful steadiness of a man reading from a prepared text. "I agree completely," I said, "which is why I have never said a negative word about you to Emma in 10 years. Not once. Whatever war you believe is happening exists entirely in your own mind. Stacy's smile held, but something behind it flickered. What we're asking, she said, dropping the gentleness entirely and moving into a register that was more direct, is that you consider divesting the Apex acquisition. It puts Daniel in an impossible position. It's destabilizing for the whole team over there. If you're serious about Emma having a stable family environment, stop, I said. She stopped. What you are doing, I said, is using my daughter's well-being as a negotiating chip in a business conversation. I want you to understand that I notice that. I am noting it very carefully. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had edges to it. That's not what Daniel started. I think we're done, I said. I'll have Priya show you out. Stacy stood. Her composure cracked. Just slightly. Just for a second. And underneath it, I could see something that was neither warmth nor empathy. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quieter and entirely different in quality. You are making a mistake, she said. There are people connected to this situation who have been very patient. That patience has limits. She didn't specify who those people were. She didn't have to. It was a threat wearing the clothes of a warning. I held the door open and said nothing. After they left, I went back to my office and closed the door and sat down in my chair. And then, and I will be honest about this because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. I felt afraid. A real and physical fear, the kind that sits in your sternum and makes your breathing slightly too shallow. Because Stacy had not been bluffing entirely. There were, I knew from Carol's research, individuals behind the original Apex Root investor group who operated at a level that was more serious than frustrated middle management. People with money and connections and, potentially, with methods I hadn't fully mapped. But here is what I also knew. I had been afraid before. I had been afraid for 10 years. I had been afraid alone in an apartment with a screaming newborn and an empty closet and a phone that didn't ring. And that fear had not stopped me. It had, if anything, become the engine. I sat with the fear for exactly 12 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called Carol. They came in, I said when she answered. And it's time to finish this. The annual review meeting for the Apex Root integration was scheduled for a Thursday in late March. All department heads, all senior staff, and by the structure of the new parent company, the executive leadership of ClearPath Operations, which meant me. It was a standard corporate procedure, the kind that happened in boardrooms across America every quarter. There was nothing unusual about it on the agenda, but I had spent 3 weeks preparing for it in ways that had nothing to do with the agenda. The night before the meeting, I sat alone in my office until nearly 11 o'clock, not working. I had finished the preparation days earlier, just sitting. I looked at the city through the glass and I thought about the woman who had sat on an apartment floor with a laptop and a glass of wine and decided quietly and without witnesses that she was going to build something. I thought about every early morning, every late night, every moment of doubt I had pushed through without letting anyone see it. And I thought, tomorrow is not about him. Tomorrow is about every decision I made when I could have stopped. I turned off the light, locked the office, and drove home. I slept well, which surprised me. But perhaps it shouldn't have. I had been preparing for this for 10 years, even when I didn't know it. Carol had assembled, with the help of a forensic accountant named David Reyes, a detailed financial analysis of Apex Root's operations over the preceding 4 years. What David found was not subtle. There had been a systematic pattern of inflated vendor invoices, Contracts routed through a shell company that traced, after 2 layers of corporate structure, back to DRC Holdings, Daniels LLC. The amounts weren't enormous in absolute terms. This was not sophisticated financial crime. But they were consistent, deliberate, and clearly documented across 18 months of records. Somebody had been treating Apex Root's operating budget as a supplemental income stream, that somebody had signed his initials on every approval. Carol had also retained copies of all documentation related to the harassment filing, the demand letter, the recorded phone call, and the unsigned threat from Stacy's final visit. Taken individually, each was an irritant. Taken together as a pattern, they told a story that was quite clear. I sat at the head of the conference table at 9 a.m. on Thursday, with a folder in front of me and a glass of water I didn't touch. The Apex Root team filed in: Gary Holt, 2 operations managers, an analyst named Beth, who I had already identified as someone worth keeping. Daniel came in last. He looked at me when he sat down. I looked back at him and said nothing. The meeting began with the standard operational review. I let it proceed for exactly 45 minutes before I stopped it. "I'd like to take the agenda in a different direction," I said. I slid packets across the table, 1 to each person. David Reyes was present. Carol was present, seated against the wall as my legal counsel. I watched Daniel look down at the packet in front of him and see on the first page the name DRC Holdings. He looked up at me. "What is this?" Gary Holt said loudly. "This is a summary of a financial investigation into the operating accounts of Apex Root Solutions for the period covering the last 4 fiscal years," I said. Specifically, it documents a pattern of vendor payment irregularities that trace to a holding entity controlled by a member of Apex Root's management team. "This is completely," Holt started. "I'm not finished," I said. The room went very quiet. I walked them through it. Not dramatically, not with anger, calmly, with the precision of someone who has spent weeks making sure every sentence can withstand scrutiny. The vendor invoices, the shell company structure, the approvals, the timeline. I did not editorialize. I let the document speak. I watched the faces around the table as I spoke. One of the operations managers, a man named Rick, who had been with Apex Root since nearly the beginning, put his pen down very slowly and did not pick it up again. He was reading ahead in the packet, turning pages quietly, and his expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something that looked very much like the particular discomfort of a person realizing they had been working beside something they hadn't known was there. He glanced at Daniel once. Daniel did not glance back. Beth, the analyst, was doing the same, reading carefully, tracking the timeline with her finger, connecting the dates. She was the sharpest person in the room after Carol and David, and I could see the moment she reached the same conclusion the documents pointed to. She set the packet down flat and folded her hands on top of it and looked straight ahead. Then I moved to the second section of the packet, the harassment filing, the demand letter, the recorded phone call. "Over the past several months," I said, "there have been a series of actions taken against ClearPath Operations and its executive leadership that, taken individually, might be characterized as aggressive business competition. Taken collectively, and in the context of the financial documentation we have just reviewed, they appear to represent a coordinated effort to obstruct, intimidate, and damage a competing entity." Daniel had not said a single word. He was looking at the table. Gary Holt made one more attempt. He pushed back from his chair and said, his voice breaking slightly with the effort of maintaining its aggression, "You can't walk in here and—" "I own this building," I said. I own this company. I can do exactly this, and I just did. Holt stopped. The analyst Beth was looking at her packet with the careful focus of someone who is deciding very quickly which side of a situation she wants to be on. Daniel looked up from the table. He looked at me, really looked at me, the way he hadn't in years, maybe the way he hadn't since before we were married, with something stripped away from his face that I had no name for. And then he said, "Rachel." "The investigation findings have been shared with legal counsel," I said, cutting him off cleanly. "HR will be handling individual notifications according to company protocol. This meeting is concluded." I stood. I picked up my folder, and I walked out. The days that followed the Thursday meeting were, in their way, the quietest I had experienced since the whole thing began. Gary Holt resigned before HR could complete its process. He sent a terse email to the company's general inbox, not even addressed to me specifically, citing irreconcilable differences in management philosophy. Carol filed the financial documentation with the Oregon Secretary of State and referred the matter to the appropriate regulatory authorities. The shell company DRC Holdings was dissolved within 60 days under regulatory pressure. No criminal charges were filed. The amounts, while clearly improper, fell into a legal gray zone that made prosecution expensive and uncertain. But the professional consequences were entirely real. Daniel Carter was terminated from his position at Apex Root Dow, the company I now owned, for cause, on the basis of the financial irregularities. The termination was documented, legal, and appropriate. Carol ensured that every step of the process was handled by the book, because I had made clear from the beginning that I did not want anything done incorrectly. I wanted it done right. I wanted it to hold. He did not contest the termination. In the weeks that followed, the office at Apex Root felt lighter, not because I had gone in and declared victory or made any kind of speech. Quite the opposite. I said nothing dramatic. I simply showed up as I always had and ran the business. The team, slowly, adjusted to the new reality. People who had been uncertain about which way things would fall began to settle. The culture shifted, not overnight, but noticeably. People started coming to work without the low-grade tension that had saturated the place when Holt was still there, setting the temperature of every room with his loud and performative authority. Without him, without Daniel, the air in the building actually changed. I noticed it first in the way meetings ran. Shorter, cleaner, with less posturing and more actual work being done. Beth noticed it too. She stopped by my office one afternoon and said, very simply, "It's different in here now." I told her I knew. She seemed satisfied with that and went back to her desk. There was a final meeting, not the one in the conference room I have already described, but a different one, smaller, a few weeks later. Daniel called my office and asked, through Priya, whether I would see him. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I said yes. He came alone. He sat across from me at the mahogany table, and he looked like a man who had run a very long way and arrived, at the end of it, at nothing in particular. The easy confidence I had fallen in love with 20 years earlier was entirely gone. What remained was just a person, flawed, diminished, carrying the weight of decisions that had compounded over a decade into something he couldn't outrun. He said, "I'm sorry." And I said 2 words, not the words he wanted, not "I forgive you," not "it's okay," not anything that would have let him set down the weight he was carrying and walk away lighter. I said, "I know." Because that was the truth. I knew he was sorry. I knew, looking at him, that the regret was real, that somewhere beneath the bad decisions and the selfishness and the years of absence, There was a man who understood, finally, exactly what he had thrown away and what his choices had cost. And knowing that, watching him sit with it was more complete than any anger I could have offered him. He nodded. He stood. He said, "Take care of Emma," as if she had ever needed him to say it. "I always have," I said. He left. The child support arrears, nearly $90,000 over 10 years of missed and partial payments, were addressed in a separate legal process. Daniel's attorney negotiated a structured repayment agreement. The first payment arrived 90 days later. It was, I knew, likely to be the most financially stressful thing he had ever signed. I felt no particular satisfaction about that. It was simply what was owed, and it was being paid. The Apex route integration into ClearPath operations proceeded without incident. Beth, the analyst I had identified during the meeting, proved to be exactly as capable as she had appeared. I promoted her within 8 months. The operational team stabilized. The client base held. By the end of that fiscal year, the combined entity was performing better than either company had independently. Margaret Holloway took me to dinner at a restaurant we both like to celebrate. "How does it feel?" she asked me over the entrees. I thought about it honestly. "Like something finished," I said. "Like a door that was always slightly open finally closed, and I can just live. Just live now." She nodded and raised her glass. We ate. We talked about the next year, about new clients, about the Pacific Northwest market and where it was heading. We talked about Emma, who was starting high school in the fall, and had recently developed an opinion about everything, which I found exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Nobody mentioned Daniel Carter again that evening. There was no need. The summer Emma turned 15, we took a trip to Italy. It was not a lavish trip. I have never been someone who performs wealth, not because I am modest, but because the performing of it has always seemed beside the point. We flew to Rome. We stayed in a small apartment I rented near the Campo de' Fiori. We ate the food and walked until our feet hurt and sat in piazzas in the evening, watching the city move around us. Emma bought a sketchbook in a tiny art supply store near the Pantheon and filled it with drawings, buildings, faces, market stalls, an entire page of different hands she had observed while sitting at a cafe table. On our 4th evening, sitting outside with gelato as the light turned gold across the street, she looked at me and said, "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always," I said. "Did you ever hate him? Dad, I mean?" I took a moment with the question. She deserved a real answer, not a managed one. "For a little while," I said. "And then I got too busy." She laughed. It was a good laugh, clean and real, her laugh, the one she's had since she was very small. "That's very you," she said. "Is it?" "Yeah." She looked at her gelato. "I think you're the most functional person I know," which is honestly a little intimidating. We talked that evening, more honestly than we ever had before. She told me she had heard things, at school and through the periphery of social media, about her father's situation. She wasn't specific, and I didn't press. I told her that I hoped she could have a relationship with him that worked for her, on her terms, and that whatever he had done or not done had never been a reflection of her worth. She listened. She nodded. She didn't cry, which was her way, and I didn't push. I had learned by then that love at its most useful looks like not pushing. ClearPath operations in the 3 years following the Apex integration grew steadily. We added 6 clients in the Northwest and expanded into Northern California. I hired a director of operations who let me move into a more strategic role. Meetings with key clients, long-range planning, the parts of the business I found genuinely interesting rather than simply necessary. I ran the company the way I had always wanted to run something, thoughtfully, without drama, with room for people to do their best work. I bought a house, a real one, not large, not showy, but with a yard and a kitchen with good light and a room for Emma that had shelves for her sketchbooks. The day we moved in, Lisa came over with champagne and we drank it standing in the empty living room before the furniture arrived. 10 years ago, Lisa said, lifting her glass, you were sitting on the floor of an apartment counting every dollar you had. I know, I said. And now look at this. I looked around the empty room. I thought about the floor. I thought about the fear that had lived in my chest for so long it had started to feel like furniture. Yeah, I said. Now look at this. Daniel and Stacy's life, from what I could observe through the thin membrane of mutual social connections and Emma's occasional updates, did not go well. The termination for cause followed Daniel professionally. In a sector as interconnected as Pacific Northwest logistics, these things were known. He found work eventually, lower level, at a warehouse management company outside Salem. The income drop was significant. Stacy, from what Emma mentioned without being asked, had gone back to work full-time. The suburban house went on the market 18 months after the termination. I did not feel triumphant about any of this. I want to be precise about that. The bad outcome of Daniel's choices was his own doing, not mine. I had not engineered his professional decline. I had simply stopped being in the way of its natural consequences. There is a difference, and it matters. Emma still saw him occasionally. She had constructed a relationship with him on terms she had set herself. Careful, bounded, honest. I was proud of her for that. It was a more sophisticated emotional position than most adults ever reached. As for Stacy, she sent me one final email about a year after everything had concluded. It was brief. It said she was sorry for how things had gone, and she wished me well. I read it. I considered it. I wrote back, "Thank you. I wish you well also." That was the last I heard from either of them. The morning brief became a ritual Emma and I shared before school. Coffee for me, tea for her, 15 minutes at the kitchen table before the day began. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just existed in the same space, which is its own kind of closeness. She was, by any measure I could apply, becoming a remarkable person. She had her grandmother's determination and her mother's patience, and something entirely her own that I didn't have a name for yet, only a growing appreciation of. One morning, she looked up from her phone and said, "Mom, did you know there's an Italian word, rinascita, that means rebirth?" "I didn't know that," I said. "I think it's what happened to you," she said. "That's what I'd call it." I thought about it for the rest of the day. Rinascita, rebirth. It was the right word. What would you have said?